Again, for those who have been, for those who are not here this morning, maybe I can very briefly introduce Professor Barbara Harriss-Whyte, who is a professor of development studies at the University of Oxford, and has a wide ranging variety of interests in issues starting from agricultural markets, the Green Revolution. She's done an enormous amount of work on the nature of work in India. And I will not summarize all the books. Vamsi has mentioned quite a bit about her other work. Today, she's going to be speaking about one of her new projects, as I understand it, and the findings from her new project. The title of her talk is wide-ranging enough. The way it's you relabeled it anyway. It's Climate Change, Materiality, and Rice Research Project. Now, it used to be Technology, Jobs, and a Low-Carbon Future, all very big topics. So, with no further ado, Professor Barbara Harriss-Whyte.
Thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to be in Bangalore, not just to have talked to you and stimulated some very interesting questions which you have asked me over lunch and during the afternoon, but also to be able to present this project to you. Although this is a public lecture, it's also a research lecture on the first results of a research project. And I'm here representing a team, and the notable contributors to this talk are our scientist, Alfred Gaythorne-Hardy, who's currently working in the House of Commons as a scientist for the Climate Change and Energy Subcommittee in London, and Narasimha Reddy, who'll be very familiar to all of you, from Hyderabad, NIRD, Deepak Mishra from JNU, and Hema from the Madras School of Economics. Okay. Oh, is it going to? In the first part of my talk, I'm going to talk you through the background to this project, because otherwise it's impossible to explain the results. In 2002, my daughter sent me on my annual holiday with a book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Chimpanzee by, and his name has gone out, Jared Diamond. And reading that book on holiday made me very depressed and changed my life forever. And when I got home, I realized my daughters hadn't read the book. But it made me realize that as a scholar, even though I was in the last part of my so-called career, I couldn't go on working the way I did. I couldn't go on teaching the way I did. I had to take climate change into my life and do something about it. And so over the years, I have done things about it. I have tried to compare India and Britain in new ways, take the methods I have used for fieldwork in India and apply them to Britain. And then slowly, a thought process was set in motion, which I found was actually encapsulated very, very well in a paper you can Google called the Hartwell paper, which was a big grouping of people from all over the world, funded by the Japanese and the Swiss, so nothing really to do with Britain. But the same thought process is evident in the paper by Navroz Dubash and his team in the first EPW of June this year, the first week of June. And Praful Bidwai's critical book on India and climate change policy also has the same chain of reasoning. So I'm not talking for something that is way out, even though I am talking for a process of criticism of the mainstream approach to climate change. As all of you know, the mainstream approach to climate change is that of cap and trade, of instituting politically directed markets for surpluses and deficits in the production of greenhouse gases in industries where this can be measured, and combining that with subsidies to developments in the third world, so-called third world, which reduce greenhouse gases or produce less of them more cheaply than can be done in the advanced world. So that's the clean development mechanism. Now these things, cap and trade and the clean development mechanism, have had a lot of missionary activity throughout the whole world, but they're not working. They don't stand the test of history. Instead, what is happening is that greenhouse gases are being belched out at ever increasing quantities, and we should be phasing them out. The Hartwell paper, whose arguments I believe summarize the point of view I want to put forward to you best, says that not only is the global goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions not happening, but also, much stronger argument, it's not possible. It's not possible this way. And that is because cap and trade isn't working. To work well, the price for carbon these days should be between $50 and $100. And when I last looked, it was in euros, but not dollars, but that's the same difference. And it was hovering around 3, not 50 to 100. So the price of carbon, which is a political price, is not actually acting as an incentive to invest in lower carbon technologies. And why is that? That is because the permits are over-allocated. The politically administered markets are awash in permits. And why is that? Because lobbies are at work and special pleading, which means that the permit allocating mechanisms, which are not really market mechanisms, they're bureaucratic mechanisms, are too weak to hold out against the power of these lobbies. So that, plus the effect of the recession in the West, means that the cap and trade mechanism is not working. And the clean development mechanism is not working terribly well. I mean, it's been captured by China and to some extent by India. And there are big problems with the clean development mechanism too, according to the Hartwell paper. One is to describe the counterfactual, because you're not eligible for these kinds of subsidies unless you can prove that what you're proposing wouldn't have happened without the subsidy. So that's quite a difficult thing to prove. And then when you've proved it and you've got your subsidy and you have your industry up and running, the measurement of the greenhouse gases that you have prevented from being emitted is also a pretty difficult thing to do. And meanwhile, some of these projects, and I had a horror story through my email inbox about 2 days ago, where a project which had been eligible for clean development mechanism was producing vast quantities of a minor greenhouse gas, which was much more powerful than the 3 major ones, nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. In other words, it was worse than useless. On top of that, we have the usual familiar friends of rent-seeking and corruption applied to the clean development mechanism. So if you put it all together, as the Hartwell paper has done, you get a situation where you have a very profound criticism of what is going on worldwide and of the politics of global deals, which is another whole ballpark. So what is the alternative? What they say the alternative is they call relentless pragmatism. And in India, it's also called a co-benefits approach to climate change. And the argument goes that instead of silver bullets, the cap and trade and clean development, let's have silver buckshot. Let us proceed on a wide range of fronts, decarbonifying the economy. And we know that it's desirable as a benefit in itself, but we will argue the political case for these many incremental actions on the grounds of other goals which are socially desirable, not climate change because it's a terrible turn-off and because it's so very sensitive. So things which reduce greenhouse gas can be argued for on other grounds. Okay? That's the idea of co-benefits. And the Hartwell paper's goals, apart from obvious ones like renewable energy, were respect for ecosystems and energy access, an equity goal, because in Europe and in advanced countries there's a lot of energy poverty, as there is in India. So these are social goals that are put together with the climate change objective or a mitigation objective lying behind them. And Navroz Dubash's co-benefits in the June paper, just published, include growth inclusiveness, that's social inclusiveness, as well as environmental gains. So this is how the co-benefits kind of argument proceeds. And the policy instruments are not confined to administered markets, but they can also include bans and taxes and technology and possibly changes in the organization of society. So this is a kind of liberating agenda to the response to climate change, rather than fix on these quite limited policy tools which are not working. Go for a wide range. Okay, now in Britain, what I've been involved with, and I'm not spending time on this, but just to say that it's impossible to have the kind of road to Damascus revelation that I had in 2002 and not to work in my own country, even though I've spent my whole life working in India. I'm involved in a very peculiar hybrid organization, which is 3 political parties, 4 trades unions, 1 NGO, and 6 expert groups, all coming together for a project to create 1 million jobs. I know 1 million jobs is not very much in India, but it's a hell of a lot of jobs in Britain, jobs which reduce greenhouse gases. And this has been quite well coordinated and publicized, but of course the coalition government in Britain doesn't want to know at all. We're just crying in the wind. Okay, if we then turn to India, we find a lot of controversy about all these things. There's a majority view. Jairam Ramesh told me it was 90% of the Indian intelligentsia takes the view that India has a right to burn coal. And there are 2 ways this view is constructed. One is through stocks, and the other is through flows. The stock argument looks at the rubbish in the atmosphere, the planetary atmosphere, and says India contributed very little to this, 3% probably. And so there is an argument in justice that India has the right to put more muck into the atmosphere in the name of development. The flow argument is one which can also be countered by people wishing to promote coal. And that is that even though India is a far bigger pollutant than it is in the stock argument, it's, I don't know, is it number 3 or number 4? Somebody here will know. In terms of world emissions. So in gross terms, it's a big emitter now, these days. If you calculate those emissions per person, of course, India comes out very virtuous. I think it's 1.5 tons per person, compared with 19 tons for Australians and Americans and Canadians, and 9 tons for virtuous Europeans, and so on and so forth. And 5 tons in China, where we're trying to get towards a world average of 2.5 tons per person. So on those grounds, India has the right to increase the tonnage of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere in order to develop, in order to remove poverty. So it's an argument to use coal to remove poverty. Now, I don't want to go down the road of whether the coal-based development model does remove poverty. We could debate that afterwards, but I don't have time in this talk to do that. Where I want to go with this argument is the 2% argument. It's a tiny minority view, which is in a way the starting point for our research project. And that is that fossil fuel-based development is a luxury that India cannot afford, even though this is the track that it's currently on. And why not? Well, first, because the rate of degradation of natural resources is very, very rapid, and it's unsustainable. It just cannot go on. And secondly, every year, between 16 and 20 million young people enter the workforce, and they confront a development model which economists call jobless growth. Okay? It is jobless growth in the formal sector, as we were talking about this morning. In the informal sector, it isn't jobless growth, but these are lousy jobs, right? Is this the way India wants to go? That's the kind of broad structure of that argument. So on both grounds, why not leapfrog to a clean development model? Why not engineer a low carbon transition? Now the question there is to what? Because no country in the world has actually made this transition. So it's actually it's not leapfrogging, it's taking a leap into the blue, and it requires a totally new approach to development models and a new industrial revolution, which ought to be happening in advanced countries as well as developing countries like India. So the logic of that argument pushes us up against a massive question mark. What on earth is to be done? So that needs a lot of thought. So those kinds of question mark moments are invitations to procrastinate. So of course we've procrastinated. Anyway, eventually out of that process of procrastination came a project. And we noticed that in the global and the Indian response to climate change, the informal economy is completely airbrushed out of the argument. There's a big literature on the informal economy, there's a big literature on climate change response, but they don't interact at all. They're growing in separate spaces, as is the International Labour Office's project of decent work and the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector project of development of that sector. So these are all projects which are growing separately and don't talk to each other. So the first intuition was whether we could devise a proposal where these separate fields talk to each other. And this is because 90% of jobs in India, including jobs in surprisingly sophisticated parts of the economy, are not registered with proper contracts, or even if they have signed contracts, they don't have full labor rights enshrined in them. And about 60% of GDP is, as I was explaining this morning, in the informal economy, most of which consists of small-scale petty commodity production, trade, and services. And a lot of the workforce is underemployed. So, can we actually bring these ideas together and think of the economy in a new way? And I know that this is not earth-shatteringly new, because some people in this audience are actually doing doctoral research which pursues these ideas. And to think of the economy as a system of capital and technology and labor, which uses raw materials and natural resources to produce commodities, all that's fine, but also integrates physical waste in its solid form, liquid form, and gaseous form. And can we develop methods to measure these parameters in the informal economy? So the unique selling point of our research project is the informal economy, most jobs, an awful lot of the economy itself, a kind of knowledge which is not got from statistics, because there aren't any statistics, which has to be got by primary fieldwork, okay? And an approach to science which is going to be multi-field, if not multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. Now, the moment you start thinking about this, we have a problem which, I mean, is sort of praising it up, but we might call an epistemological problem. It's a big problem of how knowledge is being produced in the 21st century. There are big narratives, that of neoliberalism and that of Marxism in economics, and both of those big narratives have been roundly criticized, and both of them persist. But what has happened in social science is that in the gulf between them, an enormous number of subfields has started to sprout, each with their own specialized terminology and their own career structures, their own journals, their own societies swilling around these subfields. And in our own project, there are a lot of them. There's climate change itself, climate policy, life cycle assessment, which is the method that we have used, the study of the informal economy, the study of value chains or supply chains, science and technology studies, labor studies, policy studies. These are all separate fields. And then agriculture itself, which I'll come on to later. So the first thing that we have to do is to take, whether this is trying to be multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary is not really the point. The point is, this is how the disciplines are being constructed. And what we have to do is use the knowledge fields and put the knowledge fields together in a way which doesn't creak too much. So for the first and second objectives of our project, thinking of the economy as the combination of capital, labor, commodities, and waste, and trying to measure it, what we're going to do is to start with science and to borrow a method from science, and then to bolt onto the science a method from social science, which is compatible with the science. And I will explain what they are a little bit later on. And then when we have measured the physical materiality of a section of the informal economy, we are then faced with kind of Leninist, what is to be done kind of question. And what that will involve is figuring out where greenhouse gases are emitted profligately or where labor conditions might be improved, and figuring out whether there are technological solutions to these questions, and then how they may be evaluated through a social deliberation called multi-criteria mapping. And then with the study of livelihoods and labor, trying to bring labor, a relationship between human effort and the creation of commodities and waste, we thought we should start with decent work or standard work from the International Labour Office. Okay, now I don't know whether Professor Purnender is here. I think he is in this photograph. You're in the photograph, yes. The way we have done this is we have brought together people from different disciplinary backgrounds in learning workshops, and we've had 3 of them, and they've been, I think, quite successful. The distinctive characteristic of a learning workshop is that it's structured like a research workshop. People present research papers, discussants hammer them, they discuss the research papers, then it's open to general discussion. The only difference being that the people who present the research papers didn't write them, and that we've used expert advice on the cutting edge papers that everybody should know about in order to learn. And then people commit to reading these papers with sufficient seriousness to be able to present them as if they were their own, and for the discussants to criticize them. And we found that over a period of 1 or 2 days, if people learn about fields that they would never otherwise be exposed to, they come with different disciplinary backgrounds, they want to get different things out of the workshop, and they go away refreshed. So after the experience of 3 of them, I can tell you that this is a fast-track way of gelling a group of scientists or a group of social scientists and scientists, and of learning a great deal about one another's fields. We can do it sitting in our air-conditioned offices looking at the computer screen. We certainly can, but this is a very good way of learning about these knowledge fields. Okay, so what are we trying to do? We've begun with something called life cycle assessment. How many of you know what it is? Okay. I'm going to assume that nobody does. Life cycle assessment is a very complicated method, but built on a very simple principle, which doesn't need rocket science to understand. Life cycle assessment calculates physical burdens, in our case greenhouse gases, from every single stage of a process of production through the assembly of the raw materials, the process of production, marketing and distribution. If it's done comprehensively, it involves consumption, and then the disposal of the finished product once it's reached the end of its useful life at the end of the stage of consumption. Now, we haven't been able to do that because we've just had a pilot project and we stopped at retail, but we looked at all the processes of production and distribution up to retail. Now, in social science, in business studies and some development economics, there is a framework, an analytical framework called value chain analysis, and it's also called supply chain analysis, which has a similar concept of a ladder. So we thought, let us put these 2 approaches to the understanding of the economy together. Now, what that meant was that we couldn't study an economy through space. There is a method in environmental science called material stocks and flows, which does take a territory. My country, London and York and Limerick have been done in Europe. My village, a Turkish example. But actually, the moment you start thinking of what you have to do, you have to know about a territory in a massive amount of detail. We thought it's far too ambitious for a territorial application in India. So if you reject the territorial concept, you have to carve the economy up into sectors. So you have to take a sector. and begin with a sector. So that's what we have done. We've tried to develop a fusion of value chain analysis and life cycle assessment. Then, when that project of measurement is over, there comes the questions, the normative questions, how to improve this system according to various criteria that we have to justify. Can we do this through policies, which is how Navroz Dubash and his team have conceived the problem, or can we do this through technology, or is it a mixture of both? Anyway, the measurement side of our project has led to the experiment that I've just come to Bangalore from having finished. At least I have 2 more interviews. It's an experiment with, in taking policy implications, not as a kind of residual tail wagging a dog, but actually taking the policy implications or the technology implications of a research project out and actually talking about it with the experts involved, with policymakers, with scientists of various sorts, with journalists and media people, with private enterprise, and so on and so forth, as a concept of stakeholder. So our project has, and I'm happy to talk about this after the lecture, but I don't want to make the main body of my talk about this part of our project. But we have 4 possibilities which reduce greenhouse gases from the results of our measurement exercise. And we are now engaged in a very structured dialogue about the 4 possibilities with 30 to 40, it will be 40 stakeholders, and looking at them through criteria which are not commensurable. They can't be reduced to dollars. This technique comes from a critique of social cost-benefit analysis, where there's a unique set of social prices, one possible decision. And this is typically not how policy is made or how our brains actually deliberate policy. We typically, when we buy a car, we think, of course, of the cost, but we also think of the safety and the quality and maybe the color, and we don't reduce those to dollars or to rupees. So from that kind of intuition, this methodology has been developed. And we've made an application which takes it into a regional language, takes it out of the box of expert stakeholders to people who are directly affected by the policies and the technologies concerned. And the last part of our work came out of a complete nightmare, which was that we had assumed that, having read quite a lot of the International Labour Office's work on decent work, the project of Juan Somavia, I had simply assumed that there would be a composite index of labour quantity and quality that we could put together and use to analyse trade-offs. But there isn't a composite indicator. Instead, there's something quite different. There's 125 different labour indicators. Reason for that is that the ILO has 5 departments, and each department was allowed to generate 25 indicators. And having generated them, none of the departments were willing to prioritize them or pick winners, as it were. And so this was a theoretical and empirical nightmare, and actually it's been left in the air like that. So how to deal with the fact that you can't possibly study 125 labour indicators when you want to actually bring labour centrally into your research. So here what we did was to bring in trades unions, in particular the new trade union initiative, which has organized about 1 million workers in India, including workers in the informal economy, through movements and NGOs, and the Center for Workers' Management, which is their think tank. And to get them to identify the variables, the labor variables that are most important to them, to understand the labor process and labor organization. So we are using their summary measures in our research to try to contain the study of labor. Okay, so the next question is, why did we choose an agricultural case study, which we have? We've chosen rice. And why didn't we choose steel or aluminium or fertilizer or energy or cement or paper and pulp, which we know are responsible for about 70% of emissions? There are several answers, better and worse answers to that question. One answer is that the Center for Science and Environment has done the big polluters. It has done the life cycle assessment of these massively polluting sectors. But it has done it. I mean, I admire enormously their work, but it hasn't problematized the sector in anything like the detail that we had hoped to go into, and it didn't need to do a lot of field work to get its estimates. So we know that they are refined in the sense that they're much better than nothing, but they may be able to be refined further through field research later, but they are complete. Whereas agriculture is not studied in the same way, not in India and not anywhere else. It is thought that agriculture is not important or it's sacred. It's not important because it's a small proportion of global greenhouse gases emissions, and the estimates vary from 10 to 14%, and for India, they vary from 12 to 17%. But in 2011, I had the dubious privilege of meeting President Obama's climate change advisor in the US Department of Agriculture, who readily conceded that these statistics are based on a classification of agriculture, which is merely the phase of production, a land-based phase of production, and that if you relax that definition and you thought of the industries that supply agriculture, and then the food industry that is generated by agriculture in the post-harvest system, and if you also added the chopping down of jungle and the turning of jungle into agricultural land, settled agriculture, which is happening apace in Brazil, parts of Africa, and Indonesia, it's much more like 3 times as much greenhouse gases. And nobody really knows, which is telling you something about the state of research. And the estimates vary between 1/3 of global greenhouse gases and nearly half of global greenhouse gases. So in those terms, agriculture and the food system may be more important than has been hitherto thought. And there is this sort of sacrosanctity about agriculture, that it's an emissions floor, because we have to feed the cities, we have to feed people. But even agriculture as an emissions floor is quite poorly understood. Whether there are possibilities to reduce emissions in agriculture is not really understood. There's this argument, agriculture involves the poorest people in the world. Agricultural labor in India are some of the poorest people on the planet. Why are you going to mess up their lives by making them change what they do to reduce greenhouse gases? Well, that's not the purpose. Okay, but there is a question, is it possible to reduce greenhouse gases, which is a slightly different question. The literature on rice is of 2 sorts. One is very, very depressing, and the other is very, very high-tech. The literature on vulnerability is looking to the future and looking at predicted temperature rises and unpredictability of rainfall and drought and flood and so on and so forth, and confidently predicts, especially for this part of the world, yield declines to take place, which are going to have a critical impact on the rest of the system. And the whole structure of prices, which depends on food prices, as well as food availability and security, especially if there isn't any change in access. Because there is this egregious paradox in India that despite the Green Revolution and 300–400% increase in production, 47% of under 5 children in India are malnourished. And that's something that goes right through the income distribution from the poor to the richest households. So some things, whereas the food security bill is one approach to all this, there are many other problems that are posed by the current production, distribution, consumption system, which would certainly need to be addressed if some real disasters are not in store in countries like this one. Then there's a kind of scientific literature which focuses on adaptation, not on mitigation, on adaptation, which is looking at stresses and biotech innovations to resist salinity, drought, this kind of thing, through hybridity and GM, through splicing mangrove genes to rice and this kind of thing. And then a sort of systems literature that looks at collective action, water management, and so on and so forth. But the funds and the political energy are really in revolutionary high-tech frontiers kind of suggestions rather than in farming systems research. So I still feel very threatened by responses from audiences which say, well, rice isn't important, why did you do it? But rice is really very interesting for the kind of problem that we set ourselves. Not because it's a big polluter, I repeat, not. But because it's biophysically very complicated, because the three main greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, are emitted in the process of rice production. And rice also sequesters carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. So in scientific terms, it's very interesting. And rice is also produced in a vast range of production methods, and so it's complex in social and technical terms. And we're looking at 4 production methods, and I don't know how many marketing systems. They all intertwine. They're very difficult to disentangle. But the sector of rice is social, in terms of social science, is actually also very interesting. And then, if you want a policy justification, you can have it, because employment and poverty are entwined in the production and the distribution of rice. It's of intense policy interest. Rice employs a vast number of people in the most awful terms and conditions. If you're a woman in Orissa, you take home after 8 hours back-breaking work, you take home 40 rupees a day, and if you're a man, 100 rupees a day. And then production and distribution weaves in and out of the informal economy. And that's of theoretical and of policy interest as well. And food in general is regarded, as I said before, as a bit sacred. It's generally exempted from climate change scenarios. So we wanted to incorporate it. So for us, and the personal reason is that my own network of colleagues, academic colleagues, the people of that network, the people who didn't think I was crazy, are people with a biological background, or people who've got long research careers in rural development. So we have done this biological case study, this rural case study, rather than looking at cement or energy. Okay, now we go on to a set of photographs just to ram home to the audience. I'm sure you're very familiar with all of this. The way coal is used to produce food. Here is a well-boring lorry, which is working on diesel and is boring down through open wells in southern India, through the granite to aquifers, which are water-bearing fossil aquifers that will never be replenished, which are now being mined, and mined through water lifting technologies, which either use diesel or electricity, okay? So all that is basically using coal to lift water. Firstly, to create the well, and then to lift the water. Then seedbed preparation. Here is a nice little picture because it shows a tiller which is made of metal, has embodied greenhouse gases in it, and is using diesel, coexisting with a pair of bullocks, which are doing the same thing in another field. And here they are again, the tractor versus the bullock. This is a slide to show that not all processes involve diesel and carbon dioxide. This transplanting is incredibly labor intensive, but the prompt this photo triggers in my mind is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And in this case, when a paddy field is flooded deeply with water, I'm not an engineer or a soil chemist, but the soil chemistry produces nitrous oxide and methane. And I've been speaking just in the last fortnight to farmers who are intimately familiar with the process of methane bubbling from the soils in their flooded fields. You don't have to persuade them at all. They can see it with their bare eyes. So, and the other thing water does is that it acts as a weed killer. So water is great, acts as a weed killer, but it produces an anaerobic environment in which nitrous oxide and methane are also produced. You can't get around it. Here's a guy who doesn't have a face mask, who's using pesticide to remind us that fertilizer and pesticide are also produced and create embodied greenhouse gases in their production. Then this is a picture of people who've earned their livelihoods as agricultural laborers to show that they aren't being chauffeur-driven around in Porsches, that they are some of the most poor people in India. This slide is to remind us that there are livestock cultivation relations, which may be surprising to people. I kind of think of organic agriculture as good, and I think of the use of bullocks and the use of manure rather than fertilizer as good. I came to this project with a set of value judgments which I had never really scrutinized. And of course, manure is good. It's good for soil structure. But as manure decomposes, it emits methane. And in some production systems, it emits vast quantities of methane. Okay, then when we come through to the post-harvest system, we have, instead of the bullock cart, we now have the lorry going to market based with embodied greenhouse gases in the lorry and direct emission of greenhouse gases through diesel. Now in this part of Tamil Nadu and in Andhra, all my working life, and I've been studying markets for 40 years, regulated marketplaces have been growing weeds. Farmers avoid them like the plague, and they avoid that kind of Regulated Market Act's law, which governs the first transaction between farmers and traders. And why did they do that? Because they were already indebted to traders who were calling the shots and telling them where and when they should market their produce. But somehow in the last 10 years, they've wrenched themselves free, and it's reckoned that only 15 or 20% of farmers are still indebted to traders and moneylenders. Mostly, they take their produce to the regulated market. As you can see, there's yards and yards and yards of these sacks. And what that does is increase the total transport costs, because the crop is being brought to one centralized point instead of being brought to a number of decentralized points for storage and milling. So the diesel component in these new marketing systems has gone up. And finally, around the town I have been studying, Arni, since 1972, there is a new ring of steel. And these are fully automatic modern rice mills where practically no labor is involved. There is some labor, but very, very little. It's a huge wave of displacement of mostly female labor. And as you can see from the very architecture of these mills, they're very highly capitalized. And instead of using the free heat of the sun to dry the paddy prior to milling, they're using wood and they're using rice husk. So there's a biomass element as well as diesel and electricity in the rice mills. And we haven't quite got to the end, because all of you will be familiar with buying rice from sacks in grocers' stores, yes? Sacks of rice and millet. But in grocers' stores now, even in the little town economy, little sort of mofasilik economy, the rice is being pre-packed into plastic bags, which may or may not contain the weight that is printed on them. And the whole process of branding, my particular brand of dal, my brand of rice, all that is proceeding apace. But there are greenhouse gas components in the plastic as well. And finally, some of the fields, not in our survey, but here you have evidence, this was near Chenglipet, that the fields are being burned, which releases greenhouse gases directly into the atmosphere. Okay, so what did we try to do? We tried to accept complexity and to measure variation in the entire rice supply chain from production to distribution. We stopped at retail because we just didn't have time, and this was a pilot project to try to get these methods up and running. And we wanted to study how and when and why money and greenhouse gases and labor interact to produce commodities and externalities, what economists call externalities. What we wanted to do is to bring the externalities in and to concretize their measurement. And so the physical criteria that we studied were not just greenhouse gases, but also water and energy disaggregated between fossil energy, that's energy from coal and gas and oil, and then animal and human energy. So it's a very disaggregated study of energy as well as everything else. And then economic variables, of course, costs and returns, because profitability is of the essence in an economic system. And then specifically the quantity and the quality of labor. So this sounds easy. We had 4 farming systems, looked at different kinds of transport, different technologies of mill, and 2 different kinds of retail, small retail and supermarkets. But you can see that this generates an enormous amount of complexity, and we are wading around in this complexity. Now, this is a diagram I drew long before I had read Jared Diamond in 2002 of the distribution system. This doesn't include production at all in West Bengal, the distribution system for rice. And you can just see how complicated it was evolving. that development of the post-harvest system doesn't mean simplification. It means complexification. What we had to do for the project is exactly the opposite. We had to stylize it in order to study it. So we stylized production. I would love to kind of map the political economy categories I was talking about this morning. Petty production, petty capitalism, all these kinds of relations of production. But from the science point of view, this part of the project was governed by the needs of the measurement problem, and for that we had to stylize. But this, so we went from that, or the possibility of that, to this. But then even that becomes very rapidly very complicated. When you add to the simplicity of this stylized production distribution system the measurement of all the environmental variables which are in green in this diagram, then the labor variables which are in red, and then the economic variables which are in cost. And our environmental economist, Hemmer, is hell-bent on measuring on all kinds of simulation and measuring things which are not in the cash accounts of producers. Okay, so we know out there is complicated. We have made it simple for the purposes of measurement, but the purposes of measurement, again, make it complicated. We can't get around it. Okay, so the rest of my talk is about the results of the project. And I'm going to take it through the parameters that we have studied: water, energy, greenhouse gases, costs and returns, labor, and so on and so forth, perhaps not in that order. Okay, this is an amazing diagram which took 18 months to produce, this single diagram, full time. Along the horizontal, they aren't really axes, there's a horizontal and a vertical. Along the horizontal is the system that we have studied, which was presented vertically in that other slide. So there's the farm and then the post-harvest system with the lion's share of the environmental indicators are taken by production, aren't they? The marketing system takes very little of it. I was absolutely certain. I mean, I had a starter hypothesis I was quite proud of, because I've been studying trade and marketplaces for over 40 years and been in mills and in lorry yards and very dirty places in India. And I was sure that once distribution was added to production, the major epicenter of greenhouse gases would be the system of distribution. But I have to eat my words. That is just not the case. It is production and not distribution that generates greenhouse gases, that uses most energy and uses most water. All right, so there we are. And so if we want to do anything about environment, we can forget the distribution system for the moment. We have to focus on production, which is why my fieldwork that I'm almost finished with is looking at production and mitigation possibilities. However, with the blurring of the eyelashes, you can see that large quantities of the profit line at the bottom are taken by the large mill. Yeah? So there are very few mills where there are hundreds of thousands, millions of producers. So what that is showing us is what we have found in studies of marketing systems all along, which is that the mill itself has a dominant role in the agrarian economy. And you might look along the bottom row to the right and say, what on earth is going on with supermarkets? Because supermarkets should be taking a large profit. But with supermarkets, rice is being used all over India as a loss leader. Do you know what that means? It's being given a very low markup to attract custom in, which then pays a much higher markup for fruit and vegetables and meat and fish in supermarkets. In other words, it's being used to entice customers. And in another way, we could call it a cross-subsidy inside the supermarket. So that's why the rate of return to the sale of rice inside the large retail unit is so small compared with the costs. Okay, so that is the summary of what we have found. But let's go on to the physicality, a real true materialist analysis of this production system. Firstly, the 4 production methods. One was rain-fed, and this was studied in Orissa, and it produces very low yields, 2 tons a hectare. A second was somewhere between rain-fed and intensive, what we're calling HYV. HYV doesn't mean a particular seed, but it's kind of code for intensive production methods. So SRI is being cultivated in Andhra with half the water, half the fertilizer, half the pesticides, and much higher yields than high-yielding varieties produce, 7 tons per hectare, which is a very respectable kind of return in physical terms. High-yielding varieties and organic were studied in Tamil Nadu. High-yielding varieties produce about 5 tons of paddy per hectare, and organic just under 5 tons. Organic uses the same amount of water as high-yielding, but it doesn't use fertilizer or pesticides. It's truly organic. High-yielding uses a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticide. Okay? So 4 different production methods. So first of all, let us look at greenhouse gases. The amazing thing, or the amazing difficulty, I should admit this, it's a scientific difficulty, is that it's really difficult for us, excuse me, to dissociate production methods from the agroecology, in particular the depth of the water table. So we studied SRI, which means systems of rice intensification, this kind of in-between organic and high-yielding varieties in Andhra, where the water table was 27 meters depth. And we studied high-yielding intensive rice in northern Tamil Nadu, where it was 7 meters. So it's difficult to make a conclusion about production methods that isn't dependent on the depth of the water table. So what our scientist has done is model the whole thing using the data from the field, but with a 7-meter water table. And the amazing take-home result, which is a very astonishing result, which we didn't expect at all, is that there is no significant difference in statistical terms between the greenhouse gases that are produced by the 4 technologies when we model a given sort of subterranean water regime. So what you need to remember if you're interested in facts as well as ideas is that a kilo of paddy produces a kilo of greenhouse gases. However, the constitution, the constituents of that kilo of greenhouse gas are very different with the different technologies of production, the different production methods. Carbon dioxide is the blue part of the bar, very, very little from rain-fed rice, because it's coming from fertilizer and it's coming from coal in the water, the irrigation water. So since organic and high-yielding varieties use a lot of water, there's most carbon dioxide in those methods of production. Methane is coming from practically everything. It's coming out of the backside of bullocks in rain-fed, and it's coming from the decomposition of organic manure in rain-fed and in organic and in SRI. So wherever organic manure is substituting for fertilizer, methane is being produced. And wherever bullocks are being used rather than tractors, methane is produced, and you cannot get round it. It's very, very difficult to see how you reduce methane. Nitrous oxide is produced in the soils in aerobic conditions in rain-fed rice, and to some extent in anaerobic conditions with flooded paddy, but also wherever fertilizer is overused, and nitrous oxide is also produced. So, okay, so we have this peculiar result which we didn't expect. The result comes from the very meticulous measurement of every single stage of production. And here we see for high-yielding varieties where the greenhouse gases are coming. Not very much from fertilizer, mostly from irrigation and from the chemical processes in the soil itself. On the far right, you can see carbon fixing, but people who come up to us and say, well, all agriculture is wonderful because it fixes carbon, don't realize the amount of carbon that's fixed is quite small in relation to the greenhouse gases that are actually emitted in cultivation. So this is another way of saying all this. Then when we look at the other methods of production, SRI is very similar, but lower irrigation-based emissions. And organic is also quite similar, but a lot more soil methane because we're not using fertilizer, we're using farmyard manure. Again, you just cannot get around it. But when we look at rain-fed, we see that the emissions, they're quite low, but they also come from very different parts of the production process from high-yielding varieties. A lot in cultivation, in preparing the land, a lot in farmyard manure, and a lot of nitrous oxide in the aerobic soils in which rice is produced. Okay, and the last bit of greenhouse gases, a kind of policy headline from our research, which is that the efficiency of nitrogen is incredibly low in all these systems, and this is something that could be improved immediately because far too much fertilizer is being applied. And in all these systems where fertilizer is applied, far less could be applied without any bad impact on yields and simply a reduction in greenhouse gases. Okay, so those are the results for greenhouse gases. Now moving to water. The take-home message is that a really colossal amount of water is used in rice, up to 5 tons of water per kilo of paddy. That's per 0.6 of a kilo of rice in intensive production methods. And in Andhra's sort of middle system of rice intensification, SRI, it's just below 2 tons of water per kilo of paddy, 1.9 tons. That's a hell of a lot of water for rice. And clearly, if rice could be produced with less water, there would be huge greenhouse gas improvements. We're the first people to admit that measuring water is a fool's game, absolutely incredibly difficult. Our scientists first tried to get farmers to know the area of their fields and to actually model day by day the depth of water in the field, how much was evaporated, how much they replenished. But the results were bizarre in the extreme, and farmers don't really know. And when electricity is free, it's really difficult to ask a farmer how much electricity you use. They don't know. And supply is not just free, but very erratic. And so farmers don't have meters, so they can't indicate with precision how much they use, and often they keep their pump on. So what we have done is build profiles of electricity use from farmers who knew their well depth, their water table depth, the hours of motor use that was generally the case during the day, the horsepower, and then an efficiency factor, because there's a lot of literature from engineers which say Indian pump sets are really not efficient. And any pump set that's exposed to sudden cuts in electricity supply is going to need repairs much more than, and is going to be much more inefficient than a pump set which is supplied with a regular source of energy. Okay, the other big problem with water I've been through is water table. And so we've used 7 meters as a baseline, but here's the simulation for greenhouse gases with the 27-meter baseline. And there are significant differences between the technologies, and it's all due to coal in the water irrigating the land. Okay, so that's the story for water. Let us turn to the story for energy. In this photo, our attention is taken by the lady, but in the background is the electricity pylon bringing energy to the fields. The first aspect of the result is yet another blowing sky high of assumptions which one might have thought were scientific but are actually proven not to be. They're just prejudices. And in production, as we'll also see in post-harvest system, diesel is just not important. And that includes the embodied greenhouse gases of the tools that are diesel powered. Fossil energy has enormous differences between the different production methods. Rain-fed uses very little fossil energy because they're using bullocks, and the others are somewhere in between, and for high-yielding using most fossil energy because of the fossil energy in fertilizer as well as transport and lift irrigation more than anything else. So this is where the land preparation, fertilizer, and irrigation are the main sources of use of energy in agriculture. And the return on energy, on fossil energy, is very, very high to rain-fed. It sort of goes off the scale, simply because so little is used in rain-fed. And when we factor in all the forms of energy, including animal energy and human energy, then the advantage, the energy productivity of rain-fed is much, much less. Okay, that's the energy story. And now we turn to the economic parameters that we have measured, one being labor and the other being costs and returns. labor demand, we have very varied systems of production, but labor is extremely concentrated in 3 of the production methods. This is SRI in Andhra, high-yielding varieties, and organic in Tamil Nadu. You'll see that transplanting and weeding are labor peaks, and harvesting to a lesser extent. But when we put rain-fed in, again, we find that the labor demand of rain-fed rice is very, very different. Much more labor in seedbed creation and field preparation. What's called cultivation is what I would call plowing. Look at contract, daily labor, coolie labor, piece rates, and so on and so forth. He has calculated labor in terms of effort, and effort in terms of minutes of labor per kilo of paddy. And the story there is at one end of the spectrum, intensive agriculture produces a kilo of paddy with 7.5 minutes of labor. So when you're eating a kilo of rice or cooking one, it'll be about 5 minutes of labor that has gone into producing it. But it's about 10 times that much. Well, no, it's about 8 times that much when we look at rice which has been produced in rain-fed production methods. It's 49 or 50 minutes. And of course, what is happening in India progressively is that fossil energy is being used to displace labor. And so labor productivity is going up. And in Tamil Nadu, for all I know, in Karnataka also, transplanters are going to be the next wave of labor displacement, displacing female labor in the nursery transplanting. And there's a whole debate about NREGA and the extent to which NREGA is resulting in a withdrawal of agricultural labor from these backbreaking kinds of work in the fields. Okay, and there's a policy question here too, which is there are large tracts of India where we're not talking about a choice of work. We're talking about either some work or no work at all, and some work which is very poorly paid, or no work at all. And the question is rain-fed rice good from the perspective of labor? Because it employs so much more labor than any other production method. And it employs a very different kind of labor. It employs family labor and exchange labor, which are all but unknown in the southern part of India. It employs people at very, very low rates. I gave these rates earlier, whereas in Andhra it's about 180 and 150 for men and women. In Orissa it's 140 for women. Very, very low, sort of poverty wages. And the scale of improvements in labor productivity between rain-fed rice and high-yielding rice are at the bottom of this slide. It's a relationship between about 8,000 rupees a hectare for labor in rain-fed rice and 25,000 rupees per hectare for intensive methods of rice cultivation. And what do you want? Do you want to maximize employment? Do you want to maximize lousy jobs? What is wanted in India? We all know that there are problems of unemployment and underemployment. Should we go for employment creating methods of production? These are things that we should discuss afterwards and should be being discussed from a policy point of view. Or do you take the view that this work is absolutely ghastly and people should be allowed to leave it, and this kind of production should be transformed in a different way? The gender story, if we can think of this slide as representing in the middle rain-fed primitive conditions, and on the left advanced conditions, and on the right intermediate conditions, what the slide is showing is that over time the total amount of labor effort hours goes down, and family labor yields to casual labor, wage work, and a balanced ratio between men and women in production of rice cedes to a system which is casualized and feminized. That's what this slide is showing. So there's a tremendous transformation in gender relations in production with these 4 production methods. Okay, so having looked at all these parameters, let us try and look at interactions, and we've only just started. And our initial results are just quite interesting, which is why I put this session in, and then we'll go to the final session of the talk. we can look at the interaction of labor and greenhouse gases. We can see the economy as a system of human effort producing commodities and waste. Here is the relationship in rain-fed agriculture, and you'll see that it's pretty direct. There's a more or less direct relationship between work, costs, and greenhouse gases. And the reason for that is very simple, which is that coal is not, fossil fuel is not mediating this relationship very much at all. And to compare that, keep that in your head, and compare it with intensive rice cultivation, where the relationship between labor and costs and greenhouse gases is very complicated and not direct at all. The reason for that is clear. It's that fossil fuel is mediating that relationship, that as agriculture intensifies, the relationship between human effort and the emission of greenhouse gases becomes very complicated. So the last part of this talk is about costs and returns, and when you're in India, you're constantly asked about policy and policy implications. Some simulations that we've been able to do that try to resonate to kind of policy questions. Now, we look first at production, and then we're going to look at the post-harvest system. And we're going to look at questions of improving conditions to labor. We've seen that in rain-fed, there's a very direct connection between labor and greenhouse gases. What's the connection between labor and profit? Let us ask the question, since the labor in agriculture is poorly paid, what would be the result of improving their wages by 25%? Now, we're not simulating a wage throughout the system. We're using the wages that were actually used in Orissa, Andhra, and Tamil Nadu. And what that shows is that although profitability declines, the second column, the profit increase is actually a decrease, all the production methods are still profitable if you pay labor better wages. The second simulation is a hot potato, and that is charging for electricity, which is currently free in Andhra and free in Tamil Nadu. And what we have done is simulated a 2 rupees a unit price for electricity. And when we do that, that's the costs that are inside the oval on this slide. You can see how it disrupts the cost structure. And what it does is increase the cost of production by, I think, 6% for high-yielding varieties and 12% for SRI because of the depth of the water table, and 15% for high-yielding varieties in Andhra with a low water table. So this is a ghastly result with huge political implications, because although what it shows is that if you model a shallow water table and you cost electricity in rice production, all the farms are still profitable. They're only just profitable. And the moment you add a deep water table, they are not profitable. So the water table depth is combining with free electricity to make agriculture possible, which is a very important political fact. In other words, if you did cost electricity at a market rate, let alone the social costs, including externalities, you would have to do something about the minimum support price, which in turn would increase the basic wage goods and disrupt the structure of prices in the whole of the non-farm economy in India. So you might say that it's more responsible to subsidize electricity, given the chaos that this would cause to the price structure in the rest of the economy. And the last simulation is a dodgy one, and it's to try to charge for the externalities of the system. And our environmental economist, Hema, is going to do this in a great deal of detail, and these are just indicative calculations since our scientist, Alfie, has got his model up and running. This is what it seems to show. And what he has done is taken what I think is a very high price for carbon dioxide, 12 euros, which sort of being interpreted as $12. When I said at the start of this talk that the price of carbon dioxide has tanked and is very, very low right now. And I suppose what this does, if you do a simulation at what is actually high price, is that it reveals what the implications would be for the cost and profit structure in a very stark way, in a much more stark and obvious way than it would do if you chose a low price for carbon. So if you charge for the externalities, everything goes negative. Again, this is a really important result. I know that the likelihood that greenhouse gases will actually ever be charged is very unlikely, but it would turn agriculture unviable at a stroke. So that's the result for production. And if we turn to look at the post-harvest system, marketing, and this is an old mill, Raja Babu's rice mill in Arni, which is not a fully automatic rice mill. Looking first at lorry transport, the result there, we have simulated a long distance for the same reason as simulated a high price for carbon. And it's not an unrealistic simulation, because in northern Tamil Nadu, paddy is being transported as paddy from northern Andhra, being milled in northern Tamil Nadu, and then being transported again as rice to be sold in Madurai and Trichy and places in the southern part of Tamil Nadu. So although 750 kilometers sounds a very long distance, it's quite realistic in terms of the extraordinarily widely integrated logistics of supply to these rice mills in northern Tamil Nadu. And what this particular, on the left is the structure of costs in transport, which I won't go into. On the right is greenhouse gas generations. And just 3 points about this. Firstly, again, embodied emissions are very, very unimportant. And we've taken a 20-year life, which is what you're supposed to take for this kind of equipment. That most of the greenhouse gases are emitted by diesel, but the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by the lorry, the dirty lorry, is actually very, very little. And if we add that to production, we'll find that it's absolutely insignificant. However, if we added to the cost of diesel a factor for the greenhouse gases emitted by these lorries, many of the lorries wouldn't make a profit. And again, it's showing how fragile the profit margin is in agriculture and in this part of the post-harvest system. And I don't know how the structure is in Karnataka, but where I myself have done field work on the structure of the lorry industry, there are very few people who own more than 2 or 3 lorries. It's not a question of a big monopoly or oligopoly in the lorry sector. Most people have a few lorries. It's a kind of structure which is, in industrial organization terms, quite competitive. If we then turn to rice mills, and look at large ones, not the little huller mills or the husking mills. Again, we've got the structure of costs, which shows how important paddy is, and capital. But the interesting thing is its fragility, or at least I'm not sure whether it's actually fragile, because we don't know the rate of return well enough yet, because we haven't finished that survey of rice mills. But if we look at the bottom right of this slide, we can see that the bulk of the greenhouse gases are coming from electricity, but also from diesel, which means that all these mills are oversupplied, overcapitalized. Why do they have diesel as well as electricity? Because of the power cuts. They have to mill to a very high capacity utilization to break even. They have these huge logistical supply networks, and they have to work at high capacity. So they have to have diesel engines, as well as use electrical motors to get the energy that they need to mill the rice. And the other alarming thing here is that there's quite a high column for biomass use, and that is the use of husk, and increasingly the use of wood to dry the paddy after it had been parboiled down to 10% when it can be milled. And in the old days, it was just laid out on a column, on a drying yard, and it was sun-dried. And now, in order to enable milling right through the monsoon season, to not have a slack season in these mills, to kind of make them weatherproof, they have to use a lot of biomass. The simulations are on the bottom left. Profits would be reduced by about 2% if labor in mills were paid better, but you can see that labor costs on the diagram on the left-hand side are a very small proportion in the cost structure. And again, a small decrease in profits if greenhouse gases were charged for, not the kind of devastating impact that would happen in the transport sector. Okay. Lastly, retail. Large retail, which is the green column, uses an enormous amount of coal. It uses it in refrigeration, and it uses it in air conditioning to invite you in to browse in the supermarket. And on the right-hand diagram, you see the huge difference in greenhouse gas intensity of the supermarket against the family firm, the mom and pop store, as it were. You also see the very small role played by embodied greenhouse gas emissions compared with current greenhouse gas emissions. The only other thing to notice on this slide is that the pay is pretty good. It's better pay in retail, both in the small scale sector and in the supermarkets, than it is in agricultural production itself. Okay. This is just a slide to remind me to tell you that to put storage losses into this system would be a whole different research project. And we're unable to do that. And it might make a difference to the calculations. Generally, I feel that there's a big literature on storage losses in food systems in India. And wild figures, 30, 40, 50% of loss, are being bandied about. In the 1970s, the FAO was rash enough to talk about 30% losses in the post-harvest system. Michael Lipton and a team then from the IDS in Sussex and the FCI in India did a field study in Andhra Pradesh, and they found that it was more like 7%, not 30%. And that was annualized, and most people never stored for anything like up to a year. So that the real storage loss was more like 3%, not 30%. And I suspect that this storage loss figure is being exaggerated in order to make a case for a cold chain, for the investment in infrastructure for the corporate sector to have cold chains. But anyway, that's just my suspicion. And as I've said many times through this talk, this project has blown sky high, a lot of suspicions that I started out with. Okay, making it all simple. It has been all complicated. First message, agricultural production dominates the supply chain. It's not a matter, if we're concerned with greenhouse gas and environmental variables, forget marketing, it is production that is most important. That greenhouse gas emissions are highly dependent on the water table. And at a shallow water table, there's no significant difference between the production methods. At deeper water tables, SRI and rain-fed show very, very significant savings in greenhouse gases. That labor use, the amount of employment that's generated in this particular sector of the economy varies enormously, and it is at its highest in SRI in Andhra and in rain-fed rice in Orissa. Now, what to do about this? There are things that could be done. As I told you when I was talking about the literature on rice, the literature focuses on adaptation, doesn't look at mitigation. What about mitigation? You could definitely reduce methane through being much more careful about irrigation and very much more careful about slinging manure, farmyard manure, on the fields, not more than needed, and not just before flooding, because if you do that, you basically create a methane factory. So it's not saying don't use organic manure, but be very careful how much and when you put it on the fields. You can reduce CO2 by using less water. And the other ways in which, I'll just let it go because that's going to, we can reduce CO2 by reducing transmission and distribution losses, as well as reducing the amount of water in irrigation. And we can reduce nitrous oxide emissions through being more efficient in, it's mine, being more efficient in the use of chemical fertilizer. Many farms are putting far too much fertilizer on, and through deep water flooding. But with deep water flooding, there's a trade-off between less nitrous oxide and more methane. There's no solution. There's no optimal solution. With water, the best option of all is this Andhra way of producing rice through the rice intensification. Less water, less fertilizer, less seed, less pesticide. But not significantly less if we compare hectare per hectare, but because the yield is so much greater with SRI, according to our measurements, per kilo of paddy, much less water. Okay. In terms of energy, what we need to remember is that irrigation dominates and fertilizer dominates, that diesel isn't important, that the return of rice to fossil energy is positive for all and very positive for rain-fed, and that even when we factor in all forms of energy, it turns out to be a positive to energy, with the exception of rain-fed, but we're just having the figures tested on rain-fed. When we look at transport, even if we simulate it over a very long distance, transport plays a very unimportant part, both economically and in terms of greenhouse gases. The cost of transport is much more important, even though I say overall it's not important. Cost structure is more important than greenhouse gases. And the profitability of transport is enormously sensitive to the price of carbon. And this is because it's competitive. And the margins on transport in this part of India are very low. Modern rice mills are very, very highly mechanized, so capital is a very big component in the cost structure. We have discovered that the role of biomass in the milling sector hasn't been published in scientific work on markets and the environment in India. So we think that this is an important factor, and certainly that biomass emissions are more important. And this has implications for the immediate physical environment, because how do you get wood? How do you get husk? You may get the husk as a byproduct of milling. How do you get wood without chopping down trees, without a kind of corresponding process of casuarina and wood fuel cultivation? And there's no sign of district planners or anybody realizing that the new ring of steel around these marketing towns is going to need new planning for biomass. I think I'll leave that there. And the conclusions to retail is that large retail, the supermarkets, big retail, surprisingly carbon intensive, although our sample size is currently very low, and that is due to refrigeration and air conditioning, what we love so much. And probably today we've emitted a lot of greenhouse gases in this workshop. And that quantity of labor is important in retail, both sorts, small and large. And quality, measured very simply by income, is quite high in supermarkets, but higher in small labor, in small retail than it is in supermarkets. And the trade unions really didn't want to accept that result. And it's due to very long hours of work in small retail, and to the kind of management role that labor has in small retail, because it's very often a family business. But the interesting thing from the purpose of trades unions and labor organization is that the terms and conditions of work in big retail and supermarkets in India is pretty awful. Most people hadn't got a written contract. Most people didn't know their labor rights. They were certainly not members of trades unions. So we kind of have this image of big retail involving formal registration of the retail outlet, and then with implications for better conditions for labor. But that isn't actually so. Okay, this is my final slide, that we have been as careful as possible in our measurements and our extrapolations. We have used a combination of secondary data where we can't, certainly for fertilizer and pesticides, we couldn't make an original study of energy or any of those industries, so we've used coefficients from secondary research. But we have made our primary measurements as carefully as we possibly could. But we don't think that those can be turned in easily into prescriptive tools, because sustainability is much more complicated, as the environmentalists at Azim Premji University know, much more complicated than just the factors that we have looked at, water, energy, and greenhouse gases. And biodiversity is important, And in the past, people have said, well, what about the pollution of agrochemicals into the water table and wastewater? And all these things are things that we couldn't see, but would need to be factored in if you were being systematic about studying the economy as a waste-producing system. But we are going to claim, because we can't find any other published evidence, so it does suggest that we have been looking at these multiple elements of sustainability along a production distribution system for the first time, and the research has raised issues about trade-offs because there isn't a superior alternative. If you ask me which is best, I can say which is least worst, right? But I can't say which is best. And we have to start looking at trade-offs and synergies, which we think is being done for the first time. That's it. That's our team. Thank you very much.
We've got not too much time left. So what I might do to give with you, I might first open up to people who are not part of the workshop, so that if people from the workshop want to ask questions, they can ask later or at the Virtual Learning Center. So, and I think we can take a maximum of 3 questions. So are there any questions from people who are not? Okay, then maybe I'll just open it up here. And we just wait.
Created question like you talked about life cycle assessment and the value chains, and there are several geographers like George Lebowski who generally critique the value chains, basically telling that they don't look the entire value chain, basically saying that they do not look at the end of life goods. So the question is that whether the life chain assessment does also look the value chain and other things like after disposing the commodity, basically recycling and other things. What happens after disposing? That's the one thing. And the other thing, what will be your suggestion for research student who wants to do a work on the solid waste to look at the technical aspects, something like this, and also environmental things, and also who wants to talk about the social relations? Like, is there a possibility or suggestion to like a synthesis both these things?
Okay, thank you.
Should we just take that?
Okay. The criticism of a method because it's incomplete is not a very difficult criticism because you can always add to it. Yeah? I mean, there are other criticisms of value chains that it focuses on the creation of value and it ignores labor. But again, that's a criticism which I would respond to by saying we can develop it. Yes? And it's true the existing value chain literature looks at technological upgrading and rents, and it has particular preoccupations, but it doesn't mean that the method can't be developed for other preoccupations and other purposes. And it is true that this study has stopped at retail, and we haven't looked at the cook stove controversies, and we haven't looked at, well, we would have to look at sewerage, because when rice reaches the end of its life cycle, it's excreted, okay? But to do a proper life cycle analysis, we would have to have done all of that. We had a pilot project on very sort of slender funds, so we had to contain it in order to get the method up and running, which we feel we've succeeded in doing, yes? And so how I would answer your question is, we have not succeeded in doing a comprehensive life cycle assessment. However, we have succeeded in getting the method up and running and combining it with a study of costs and returns of value and of labor. And we will be able to look at the distributive share, the total wage versus the total profit component throughout the system. But I didn't present it today because it's not complete. So the answer to your question is yes, these are good questions, but in the end, resource scarcities mean that we have to contain the study somehow. The other thing I would say about your first question is that whereas the life cycle analyst takes it stage by stage, I showed you incredible detail in production. Every single labor operation is also an operation in effort and in greenhouse gas creation. But the value chain analyst doesn't doesn't calculate costs and returns to transplanting or costs and returns to weeding. Yeah? For the value chain analysis or the supply chain analysis, the unit of analysis is the firm or the farm. It's an economic unit within which all kinds of physical activity takes place. So there's a kind of basic discontinuity which we can't transcend. I mean, because nobody operates with that kind of mental frame. A farmer isn't calculating the returns to every task. Or at least if they are, they're not letting us know it. The other aspect to this is that value chain analysis in social science or business studies often takes quite a short chunk of what I would call a marketing system. And there are two kinds of contradictions there. One is that how do you know what you're simplifying in value chain terms unless you know about the marketing system? And how do you know about the marketing system without studying it? That's a terrific problem. And I see this in so much work right now on markets that the marketing system has become relabeled as a value chain or a supply chain. And in that act of relabeling, it's become depoliticized and it's become simplified. And what this is doing is generating a whole generation of research, a whole school of research, which is factoring out complexity inside marketing systems. And calling them marketing systems is not sexy, it's an old term, but at least it allows a systemic analysis. Now the other contradiction, which is an easy critical shot at our project is, look, this is an open system. Now, how do you close an open system? Now, life cycle assessment has very strict rules on this, because if it didn't have strict rules, it wouldn't be possible to replicate its results. And if you can't replicate results, then it's not scientific. So the rules are that you close a system where an additional incremental component adds less than 1% to the total greenhouse gases in the system. Now the problem there is, how do you know that something adds less than 1% unless you've studied it, right? So there's no easy way out of these kinds of criticisms. But the way the value chain, a really good value chain, is conducted is by thinking about something like bran. In the post-harvest system, do we look at bran oil extraction, da-da-da? And most people don't, right? And we didn't either, and I was always a bit worried about this. And if I had been in charge of life cycle assessment, I wouldn't have done that, because I know that bran supplies half the profit that the miller gets from rice milling. That the byproduct is not really a byproduct, it's a very, very valuable raw material to the edible oil industry. Okay, so what the life cycle analyst will say is, well, we have to do this by iteration, by a sort of touchy-feely iteration of this. So it is done as carefully as possible, for the reason that it's of no value if you can't replicate this research. Yeah? So the stakes are very, very high to close an open system in a way that is justifiable and replicable. They're huge problems. Now, the second question was about how you study waste as a research student with not a lot of money. I mean, we didn't study all the waste. We didn't study the polluted water. And there are no doubt all kinds of physical waste coming from rice milling. Yeah? So you study as much as you can, but I think there's an enormous scope now to bring waste in, that it's irresponsible not to do that anymore. And then to study, to define the waste that you're bringing in, and then to study it as rigorously as possible. And one way of defining the waste is to say, okay, what is the solid waste in this system? What is the liquid waste? And then what is the gaseous waste? So this measure of life cycle assessment really is addressed to gaseous waste. And you would need another kind of field method to look at liquid waste, and let alone to turn liquid waste into greenhouse gas equivalent measures. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to routinize, to kind of normalize the idea of an economy as something which produces waste. But I do think that we will have a lot of very big surprises when this is done, and that this has to be done for the future, because we're going to drown in waste anyway. and things which have no value as waste will become valuable as raw materials in the future. So we know this useful concept of the metabolic rift, that the nutrients taken from the ground are not restituted to the ground under capitalism. Capitalism doesn't do anything unless it makes a field of accumulation. So one can confidently predict that in the next 10, 20 years, all kinds of waste which at present don't have value and which capital is not going to use as raw materials will be processed and then reused as raw materials in fields of accumulation. Will not be just left in landfill. So I think theorizing it and normalizing waste is one of the best things to come out of this project. But thank you for the question.
Okay. So this is the last question for today. The remainder is
Yeah, madam. See, coming from Andhra Pradesh, where there are a lot of software professionals, non-agriculturalists who are buying up large tracts of land in anticipation that there would be greater corporatization of agriculture and greater capitalist mode of production entering into it. As someone who has done a lot of field work, what is your assessment about this process? I mean, at least the pace at which it's happening.
This is a question in political economy and not in environment. It's not just in Andhra. There have been studies of Gujarat to show that there's a kind of reverse land reform going on, that the land reform ceilings are being ignored, and that bit by bit, very large tracts of land are being accumulated, way above the norm, the limit. It is very difficult to see how this is going to transform agriculture. The reason I hesitate is that when you talk to agricultural labor, which I've been privileged to do over the last 2 weeks, they hate this work. They want they would do anything other than this work. Perhaps they wouldn't do sanitary work, sweeping, but they would do pretty much anything else. So everybody wants to get out of agriculture, and everybody would like to sell their land for a high price. So what you have is widespread stagnation. I mean, the statistics are showing this. Only growth in high-value irrigated crops like fruit and vegetables and flowers and certain kinds of perennial crops. But if we're looking at cereals production, the yields have not really increased very impressively. Right? So there is a cost-price squeeze that I was talking about this morning. So farmers don't make a high return from agriculture. Property is increasingly miniaturized. And so if people want to buy land, whether it's for high-rise apartments or for plantation agriculture or new scale of capitalist agriculture, small farmers are going to be interested in selling. But where is the labor going to come from to work this land? And how are these holdings going to be consolidated from tiny fractions of parcels, of plots, which is how these miniaturized holdings are constituted. We know that something like 60% of producers have less than 1 hectare or something like this. But it's not a hectare in a nice football field size plot. It's divided up into tiny plots. How is this process of engrossment going to take place? Even if it's allowed politically, how is it going to take place economically? So I'm not very good at looking into the future, but I just see a big mess. Miniaturized holdings, all kinds of potential that farming systems researchers know is there for agriculture to increase yields and make a less environmental impact. And against that, these other processes of engrossment, sometimes by construction companies, sometimes by mineral water companies who don't want the land at all, but just want the water underneath the land. And I've come across cases in the last fortnight where a sugar mill wrecked a whole village's, cut the paddy land by blocking the canal, which provided the water resources to a village, and the sugar mill just blocked it without any permission. And the collector hasn't been able to unblock this land. So their land is completely worthless. They have to revert to rain-fed agriculture because they're too poor to dig wells and to afford the investment to lift the water, even if the electricity is free. Then a lot of perturbation to the water table through sand mining of watercourses, and then top slicing the soil for bricks all over the place to create India's growing cities. So there's not just a crisis of what I'd heard from some people in Andhra as absentee landlordism, which is happening from California with a new class of intermediaries managing the land. But all kinds of other economic threats and environmental threats to this miniaturized agriculture that has developed over the last 4 decades. And this poses all kinds of interesting questions for agriculture. At the time of the Green Revolution, when I was in my 20s, the big debates were what is the role of the lead farmer, how will the Agricultural Extension Service convince the lead farmer, and then how will small farmers imitate the larger farmers and innovate. And now the Extension Service has completely collapsed, and there aren't any lead farmers, and we're left with a population of small, impoverished farmers who must be risk averse, yes, and certain technological possibilities that might well improve their yield, but very difficult to get the message to them, yeah? So there are a huge number of problems of surviving miniaturized agriculture and of the rape of the natural resources on which this agriculture depends, and then the new threat from a new scale of capital. So I see what you've described as a very, very important transformative possibility, not necessarily good transformation, but something that's going to happen. And alongside that are other processes. So I think that, and alongside that, there are very few people doing fieldwork on agricultural development, rural development, the ongoing agrarian transformations of capitalism. So I would make a plea for very heroic people who don't mind getting hot to go out there and study agriculture. It's very, very interesting.
Well, thank you very much. If there's any other questions for the Wipro Learning Center, and we'll continue along that. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, we'll be back here for what's the title? It's no title. It's about urban processing. The urban processing. All right. Thank you very much.